welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, so if you are listening to this right now, you are likely part of a growing group of men who are looking around at the state of the world. You're looking at our modern institutions and you're asking some very tough, very necessary questions. You are trying to understand the historical capture of these institutions.
Right. Before they were captured by modern ideologies.
Exactly. Before they were captured by feminists and Marxists. You are seeking to reclaim a sense of masculinity in a culture that, frankly, frequently frames it as a problem.
Yeah.
And most importantly, you are on a pursuit of true, uncompromising self-reliance. So if that described you, you are exactly where you need to be today.
Absolutely.
Today's mission is substantial. We are unpacking a highly requested, deeply polarizing new ebook. It's titled Poverty and the Path to Power, A Man's Guide to Spiritual and Economic Liberation. And this is by Conrad Riker.
It's a heavy one.
It really is. Now, before we get into the mechanics of this text, please take a second to like and subscribe to the show. It is the best way to ensure we can keep bringing you these deep dives every single week.
For sure.
And listen closely. You must check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy this ebook. The insights we are going to cover today are extensive, but the book itself is the complete roadmap.
You really need the full text to get the whole picture.
You do. You also need to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack for his ongoing real-time insights. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
The core premise we are looking at today is that poverty is not simply a lack of capital. The author argues that poverty is actually a psychological and spiritual trap, one that's deliberately engineered by modern societal narratives to keep men compliant, dependent, and ultimately stripped of their agency.
Right. It is a sweeping and really provocative premise. And before we begin breaking down the chapters, I really need to establish the parameters for our discussion today. Good idea. Because this book contains very direct, often aggressive critiques of modern political and social ideologies.
Yeah, he does not hold back.
Not at all. Specifically, the text takes aim at radical feminism and Marxism, arguing that these ideologies have essentially captured our institutions to dismantle personal self-reliance.
Right.
So, our goal in this deep dive is not to endorse these viewpoints, nor are we here to take political sides. I want to make that crystal clear to everyone listening.
Absolutely. We are neutral here.
Right. Our job is to impartially report on the author's arguments. We are going to meticulously break down the historical data he presents, the economic case studies he references, and the psychological frameworks he builds. The whole objective is to help you thoroughly understand the source material so that you can evaluate the evidence and the roadmap for yourself.
That is exactly right. We are acting as your guides through the evidence presented in the text. And the text actually starts by forcing the reader to look backward.
Yeah, chapter 1.
Right. A core argument here is that you cannot understand the modern trap of poverty without understanding its historical roots. Specifically, the book points to the institutional shift that occurred during the Industrial Revolution.
Which is an interesting place to start.
It is, because usually history books frame the Industrial Revolution purely as this triumph of human ingenuity.
Like it was just a straight line of progress.
Exactly. But this text paints it as a massive double-edged sword. Yes, the technological advancements were unprecedented, but it also fundamentally changed the nature of poverty itself, turning it into a systemic urban issue.
Right.
The author focuses heavily on the United Kingdom, specifically mid-19th century cities like Manchester and Liverpool.
And that historical context is the foundation of his entire economic argument. Because think about it, before the Industrial Revolution, poverty was primarily agrarian.
Right, it was tied to the land.
Exactly. If you were poor, you were still generally operating within a system where your labor directly resulted in your sustenance. I mean, yes, you were subject to the seasons and crop yields, but you had a certain degree of autonomy over your daily tasks.
You decided when to wake up, when to harvest.
Right. But the emergence of the factory system created a completely new dynamic, a distinct working class that was suddenly entirely dependent on wage labor and dependent on factory owners.
Which was a massive psychological shift.
Huge. And to illustrate the sheer misery of this transition, the text leans heavily on historical primary sources, specifically bringing in Friedrich Engel's observations of Manchester.
Let's actually pause on that because I want to make sure we understand the physical reality he is describing. When we say urban poverty in the 1850s, we aren't talking about, struggling to pay rent in a modern apartment.
No, not at all.
The book uses Engel's description of Manchester as a literal cesspool of human misery.
It was incredibly grim.
We are talking about streets that were completely unpaved, filled with deep holes, and strewn with human and animal refuse.
Precisely. The text emphasizes the environmental and physical degradation to highlight the psychological toll. I mean, the air was so thick with industrial soot that it blocked the sun. The rivers were biologically dead, just polluted with chemical runoff from the textile mills.
It's a completely toxic environment.
And you had massive populations of agrarian workers migrating to these urban centers looking for wages. But there was absolutely no infrastructure to support them.
Right.
You had families crammed into single-room cellars, leading to rampant overcrowding and disease outbreaks like cholera. The author uses this brutal imagery to establish a point,
Which is?
that the modern economic system was built on a foundation of separating a man from his autonomy, placing him into an environment where he was easily exploited and completely dependent on an industrial overlord.
Which brings us to a really fascinating reinterpretation in the text. The author brings up the Luddites.
Yes, this is a great section.
Because in modern conversation, if you call someone a Luddite, it means they can't figure out how to use their smartphone.
Right, it's an insult.
It is a derogatory term for someone who fears progress and hates technology. But the book frames the Luddite movement in a completely different light, treating them almost as early pioneers of preserving masculine agency. Break down how the text reinterprets what the Luddites were actually doing.
Well, the historical reality of the Luddites, which the text highlights, is that they were highly skilled textile workers.
They weren't just angry peasants.
No, these were men who had spent decades mastering a complex craft. And that mastery gave them profound pride, societal respect, and crucially, economic independence.
Right.
They controlled their hours, they owned their tools, and they negotiated the price of their finished goods.
They were their own bosses.
Exactly. So when the automated looms were introduced, it wasn't just that a machine was doing the work faster, it was that the machine was rendering their lifelong mastery completely obsolete overnight.
So when they were breaking into factories and smashing the machinery, the book is arguing this wasn't just a temper tantrum over losing a job.
Exactly. The text argues they were protesting a profound loss of male autonomy.
Wow.
By destroying the loom, they were attempting to destroy the instrument that was stripping them of their agency, reducing them from respected craftsmen to easily replaceable cogs pulling levers in a factory.
That makes total sense when you frame it that way.
Yeah. The author uses the Luddite movement to argue that the transition to industrial capitalism was an initial devastating blow to traditional masculinity and self-reliance.
It basically conditioned men to accept dependency on an employer.
Okay, so if the Industrial Revolution created dependency on the employer, the book argues the 20th century created dependency on the state.
Right. The next phase of capture.
This is where the text pivots to the rise of the welfare state. And the primary target here is the New Deal, implemented in the 1930s under Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Now, I want to push back on this a bit, or at least play devil's advocate here, because the standard historical narrative is that the New Deal literally saved America from the Great Depression.
Sure.
It built infrastructure, it put people to work, it created social safety nets. How does the text justify calling this the origin point of a dependency culture?
Well, the author acknowledges the standard narrative. He concedes that the New Deal provided necessary, temporary relief during an unprecedented crisis.
Okay.
However, the critique focuses on the long-term institutional mechanics that were established. The argument is that the New Deal fundamentally shifted the relationship between the citizen and the state.
In what way?
Prior to this, the expectation was self-reliance, aided by community or church charity in times of dire need. The New Deal institutionalized the idea that the federal government is the ultimate provider.
Right.
The text argues that this laid the groundwork for a pervasive culture of dependency, because it created an infrastructure that politicians could eventually exploit.
Right. The book argues it established a dangerous precedent, where politicians realized they could essentially buy political loyalty through welfare programs.
Exactly.
And the author doesn't just state this as an opinion. He brings in a 2020 study from the National Bureau of Economic Research.
The NBER study, yes.
Walk us through the mechanics of what that study actually suggests about voter dependency.
So, the NBER study cited in the book examines the structural design of various welfare policies.
Okay.
The underlying economic theory presented is that if a politician's power and re-election rely on a demographic that needs their social programs to survive, that politician has absolutely zero incentive to actually cure the underlying poverty.
Because curing the poverty would mean eliminating their own voter base.
Precisely. Therefore, the policies are designed to be a management system rather than an exit strategy.
That is insidious.
It is. They provide just enough sustenance to keep the recipient alive and loyal to the party providing the benefits,
Yeah.
but not enough resources or structural mobility to actually achieve economic liberation.
To drive that point home, the text brings in the perspective of the economist Thomas Sowell.
A brilliant mind on this topic.
He really is. Sowell is famous for writing about how welfare systems create generational poverty traps, and the book highlights Sowell's concept of the welfare cliff.
Yes.
Explain the ELI 5 economics of the welfare cliff for us, because I think this is where the author's argument really crystallizes for the reader.
Okay. The welfare cliff is basically a mathematical trap built into the system. Let's break it down simply.
Okay.
Imagine a man is receiving $15,000 a year in various government assistance programs, housing vouchers, food subsidies, healthcare.
Right.
Now, imagine he gets offered a full-time entry-level job that pays $18,000 a year.
Okay, so a bump in income.
On the surface, working seems like the right move for his autonomy. However, the system is structured with strict income thresholds.
Ah.
By accepting the $18,000 job, his income pushes him just over the line, and he completely loses his $15,000 in benefits.
So mathematically, by going to work, he is actually poorer.
Yes.
He loses all his stability for a marginal gain in taxable income that doesn't cover the loss of the subsidies.
Exactly. The system financially penalizes ambition. If working harder literally makes you poorer and jeopardizes your family's housing, the rational, survival-based choice is to stay unemployed.
And stay dependent on the state.
Right. The author uses Sowell's analysis to argue that this isn't an accident. It is a feature of a system designed to punish self-reliance.
Wow.
The overarching thesis of this entire first section is that the historical trajectory from the self-reliant agrarian life to the exploitation of industrial wage labor and finally to the trap of state-sponsored welfare has been a systematic process of stripping men of their innate drive to provide and protect.
Which really sets the stage for the text's next major critique. Because if the welfare state created the physical and economic trap, the book argues that certain ideologies created the psychological trap. We are moving into the section on the illusion of Marxism and socialism, and the text is incredibly aggressive here, asserting that these ideologies managed to capture our institutions specifically by appealing to the poor and absolving them of personal responsibility.
If we connect this to the broader philosophy of the book, you can see exactly why the author views Marxism as uniquely destructive to the male psyche. Because the foundation of the author's worldview is absolute personal agency. Marxism, conversely, is framed in the text as an ideology that fundamentally reduces human beings to passive victims of macrostructural oppression.
Right. The narrative becomes your poverty is not your fault.
Exactly.
It is the fault of the greedy capitalists, the bourgeoisie, the system. Therefore, because you didn't pause it, you cannot possibly fix it yourself.
You are powerless.
You must wait for the collective revolution. Or you must wait for the all-powerful state to redistribute wealth and fix it for you.
Exactly. It completely removes the locus of control from the individual. And to counter the economic promises of socialism, the promise of equity and shared prosperity, the author cites a massive 2019 study from the London School of Economics.
Right.
And this wasn't a small sample size. This study analyzed economic data from 162 countries over a 50-year period.
Let's unpack the methodology there. What exactly were they measuring over those 50 years?
They were tracking the implementation of varying degrees of free market policies versus centrally planned socialist policies, and cross-referencing that with the respective national poverty rates, GDP growth, and individual wealth mobility.
And what did they find?
The conclusion of the LSE study was definitive and mathematically clear. Countries that embraced free market systems, private property rights, and individual economic agency consistently lifted massive segments of their populations out of extreme poverty. Conversely, countries that leaned heavily into state-controlled socialist policies experienced stagnant growth and higher poverty rates.
The data speaks for itself.
It does. The text uses this to state unequivocally that capitalism, despite its inherent flaws and inequalities, is the only proven historical engine of poverty reduction.
But the author doesn't just rely on high-level academic data. The text moves into some brutal historical case studies to illustrate what happens when this ideology is played out to its logical conclusion.
Yeah, these are tough to read.
The first example the book walks the reader through is Venezuela from 2016 to 2018. And it is vital to remember, as the text points out, that Venezuela was once the richest country in South America due to its massive oil reserves.
The author details the policy shifts that led to the collapse.
Right.
The Venezuelan government, running on a socialist platform, began nationalizing private industries, seizing assets and promising to artificially redistribute the wealth to create equality. A key mechanism they used, which the text highlights, was the implementation of strict price controls.
Okay, let's do an ELI 5 on price controls, because the book emphasizes how devastating they are, but to the average person, price controls sound like a good idea. Like, make things cheaper for the poor. Why does the text argue this was the catalyst for starvation?
Let's use a very basic analogy. Imagine you own a small dairy farm in Venezuela.
Okay.
Between the cost of feed, labor, and transportation, it costs you $2 to produce a gallon of milk. You sell it for $2.50 to make a modest profit.
Makes sense.
The government then steps in and declares that milk is a human right. They say the capitalists are price gouging. And by law, the maximum price a gallon of milk can be sold for is $1.
So the farmer is instantly losing $1 on every single gallon he produces.
Precisely. So what is the rational economic response?
He has to stop.
Right. The farmer cannot operate at a loss indefinitely. He slaughters the dairy cows for meat, sells the meat on the black market, and completely shuts down milk production.
Wow.
Now multiply that scenario across every single industry: bakeries, poultry farms, toilet paper manufacturers. When the government dictates a price below the cost of production, production stops.
And that is exactly how you end up with completely empty grocery store shelves.
Exactly. And the text lays out the horrific results of that collapse. By 2018, hyperinflation in Venezuela hit 1 million %.
1,000,000%.
Money became literal garbage in the streets. 90% of the population plunged into extreme poverty.
It's just unimaginable.
And the book includes the sobering, highly publicized detail that desperate citizens were breaking into local zoos and butchering the animals just to survive.
I remember reading about that.
The author uses this to hammer home the point that the poor, the very people who were promised liberation and equality by these socialist policies, ended up as starving prisoners of their own state.
The text then shifts its focus to North Korea to illustrate the extreme end of state control.
Right.
The author notes that North Korea's GDP per capita hovers around $1,700 annually, placing it among the most impoverished nations on Earth. The book contrasts the utopian promises of absolute equality with the grim reality of citizens being forced to forage for grass and bark during famines.
It's a stark contrast.
The author's primary argument here is that when the state attempts to control all resources and dictate all outcomes, all human innovation, ambition, and flourishing completely die.
Because there is no incentive to build or create when the state claims ownership of everything you produce.
Exactly. But the most chilling historical example the book uses is the Soviet Union. And it's chilling because the author focuses not just on the economic ruin, but on the psychological and social destruction.
Right.
For example, the text points to the 1986 Chernobyl disaster. Now, usually we think of Chernobyl as an engineering failure.
A technical glitch.
Right. But the book frames it as a symptom of a system that prioritized ideological purity and the infallible image of the state over actual competence and human life. The scientists couldn't report the truth because the truth contradicted the state's narrative.
And that prioritization of the state above all else is what leads to the most insidious aspect of the Soviet system highlighted in the text,
Which is...
the deliberate attempt to destroy the nuclear family.
This part was wild.
The author details how Soviet policy actively encouraged children to spy on their parents.
Just let that sink in.
If a parent expressed anti-Soviet sentiments at the dinner table, the child was taught by the school system that their highest moral duty was to report their parents to the secret police. They celebrated children who did this as national heroes.
That concept is so entirely foreign to how we view human relationships. Why would an ideology actively seek to destroy the trust between a parent and a child?
Because, as the text argues, the family unit is the ultimate rival to state power.
Right.
If your primary loyalty is to your father, your mother, your spouse, or your children, then your loyalty to the state is secondary.
The state needs to be number one.
Totalitarian systems require absolute primary allegiance. Therefore, the fundamental bonds of trust, that hold a family and a community together must be systematically broken down.
It's a deliberate unspooling of society.
The author uses this to argue that socialism does not merely impoverish a nation financially, it bankrupts it spiritually and emotionally by turning citizens against each other to ensure the state remains the sole authority.
And this is where the text brings these historical case studies into the modern context.
Yes.
The author argues that despite a century of catastrophic, murderous failures, modern media, academia, and culture have been almost entirely captured by these exact same Marxist narratives.
It's really prevalent.
The book points out the bizarre phenomenon of Hollywood and modern media romanticizing these figures.
Yeah, the text uses the example of Che Guevara's face being mass-produced on T-shirts and sold to college students as a symbol of rebellion, completely ignoring the historical reality of the firing squads and labor camps he oversaw.
It's total cognitive dissonance.
The author argues that the media relentlessly pushes a narrative that frames poverty and struggle solely as a structural, systemic problem created by capitalism.
Right.
The text posits that this media framing is not accidental ignorance. It is a deliberate, continued tactic to strip modern men of their agency.
Because if the media can convince you that the game is entirely rigged by invisible structural forces, they convince you that there's absolutely no point in trying to build your own life.
Exactly. You just give up before you even start.
So we have looked at how the author views the state's role in creating economic dependency and how political ideologies create psychological dependency. But the text argues the capture of institutions didn't stop at economics. To truly dismantle self-reliance, the book claims you have to dismantle the fundamental building block of society, the family.
Right.
And this brings us to chapter 6, which contains some of the most controversial material in the text. The author pivots to a critique of social ideologies, specifically examining the impact of radical feminism.
The central thesis of this chapter is that traditional gender roles are not an oppressive patriarchal construct designed to subjugate women, as modern narratives suggest.
Right.
Instead, the author posits that traditional, complementary gender roles are the essential bedrock of stable societies, child development, and robust economic success.
To defend the immense value of traditional roles, the book doesn't rely on 1950s nostalgia. It brings in hard economic data.
Which is crucial.
The text cites a 2020 study by Oxfam. This study attempted to quantify the value of unpaid care work performed primarily by women globally. The estimate they came up with is staggering. At least $10.8 trillion annually.
Let's contextualize that number, as the book does. $10.8 trillion is roughly 3 times the size of the entire global technology industry.
3 times the tech industry. That's insane.
The author uses this data to make a crucial point. The labor of the home managing a household, raising the next generation, providing domestic stability is a massive fundamental driver of global economic value.
Right.
However, the text argues that this incredibly valuable, culturally vital role has been tragically devalued and mocked by modern feminist narratives.
Narratives which push the idea that a woman's worth is solely defined by her corporate success and her ability to mimic masculine career trajectories.
Exactly. The text argues that the timeline for this societal fracture really accelerated in the 1960s with the rise of the second wave of radical feminism. The author points to leading figures of that era, such as Betty Friedan, who wrote The Feminine Mystique, and Gloria Steinem.
Right.
The critique laid out in the book is that these figures fundamentally changed the psychological landscape. They began painting traditional marriage, homemaking, and motherhood not as a vital partnership, but as a sort of domestic prison that women needed to be liberated from.
The author argues that by framing men as oppressors and the home as a cage, radical feminism effectively declared war on the nuclear family unit.
Yes.
And the text provides statistical data to track the fallout of that ideological shift. The book highlights that the divorce rate in the United States skyrocketed from roughly 20% in 1960 to nearly 50% by 1980.
A massive jump in just 2 decades.
The author argues this was not a coincidence, but a direct result of an ideology that prioritized absolute individual independence over familial duty and cohesion.
And the text connects that breakdown of the family directly to the very thing the book is about: poverty.
Right.
The author cites a 2019 study by the Institute for Family Studies. Walk us through what that research actually proved about the economic realities of a fractured family.
So the IFS research provides a stark statistical reality. Children who are raised in single-parent households are 4 times more likely to live in poverty compared to children raised in continuous 2-parent homes.
4 times.
The text treats this statistic as the smoking gun of the chapter. The author's argument is that radical feminism, in its zealous push to dismantle traditional patriarchal structures and encourage divorce as empowerment, has actually left a massive trail of economic devastation. And the tragic irony, according to the text, is that women and children are the ones bearing the brunt of this self-inflicted economic fallout.
The book illustrates this cultural shift by critiquing modern media narratives.
Oh yeah, the movie review part.
Right. The author points to the 2017 blockbuster film Wonder Woman. Now, culturally, that movie was universally praised as a massive feminist triumph.
People loved it.
But the author breaks down the underlying message, arguing that the subtext of the film and nearly all modern media aimed at women is essentially that women do not need men.
That men are either incompetent or unnecessary.
Exactly. The text argues this relentless messaging trains young women to view men as competitors or hindrances rather than partners.
To ground this cultural critique in reality, the author shares several personal anecdotes. He details the story of a close friend, a hardworking man dedicated to providing for his family.
Right.
According to the text, the marriage fell apart because the wife deeply internalized radical feminist ideology, eventually believing that her absolute autonomy and freedom from domestic expectations were more important than maintaining the family unit.
She initiated the divorce.
She did. And the author notes the grim reality that she now struggles significantly in poverty as a single mother, while the husband, freed from the chaotic environment, has rebuilt his life and finances.
The book also shares a very revealing conversation the author had with a high-powered female executive.
This one was fascinating.
This is a woman who achieved everything the modern feminist narrative says she should want. C-suite status, massive wealth, total independence.
She had it all.
Yet, she confessed to the author that she deeply regretted prioritizing her aggressive corporate climb over her marriage and having a family, finding herself incredibly isolated and lonely at the top of the hierarchy. The author uses these stories to argue that the promises of radical feminism are ultimately hollow and lead to both economic and emotional destitution.
It is vitally important to clarify here, as we parse this text, that the author's proposed solution is not a draconian return to subjugating women, or removing them from the workforce by force.
Yes, that is a very important distinction to make. We are just analyzing his points.
The text proposes an alternative model, a return to complementary roles.
Right.
The author advocates for relationships based on mutual respect, where men and women recognize their distinct natural strengths and collaborate, rather than engaging in a hostile competition for dominance.
Right, the book actually provides examples of female leadership that fit this complementary model. The text points to Angela Merkel, the former Chancellor of Germany. The author praises her leadership style, describing it as utilizing soft power. She led with pragmatism, steady empathy, and highly effective synergy with her male counterparts.
Rather than feeling the need to aggressively adopt masculine traits, or undermine the men around her to prove her worth.
Exactly. The text also highlights practical, modern applications of this philosophy, like a specific women in business mentorship program in the UK.
How does that one work?
In this program, young female professionals are paired with seasoned leaders, both male and female. The curriculum focuses on teaching these young women how to effectively navigate corporate careers while maintaining their feminine identity. And crucially, how to work collaboratively and respectfully alongside masculine leadership. The goal is synergy, rather than viewing men as the enemy or the patriarchy as a monolithic structure to be smashed.
Okay, we have spent a lot of time analyzing how the text diagnoses the external forces, the historical shifts, the welfare state, the political ideologies of Marxism, and the social ideologies of radical feminism.
The macro stuff.
Right. But in section 4 of the book, the author takes a sharp turn. He turns the mirror inward and looks at the spiritual and psychological dimensions of the individual.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
He makes a highly provocative claim that poverty at its core is actually a mindset. It is a spiritual condition that is fed and kept alive by a culture of blame.
This is where the text shifts from macroeconomic theory to individual psychology.
Right.
To support the claim that mindset dictates economic reality, the author cites a study from the University of Cambridge. This study analyzed the behavioral patterns of individuals facing financial hardship.
And the findings were quite remarkable.
Very. Individuals who habitually blamed external factors for their problems, whether that was the government, the economy, their boss, or systemic bias, were 30% less likely to ever improve their financial situation.
30%. That is a massive, self-imposed handicap.
It is.
The text is essentially arguing that simply by framing your struggle as someone else's fault, you are mathematically guaranteeing your own failure.
That psychological framing is critical to the book's thesis. The author draws heavily on the established work of psychologist Carol Dweck. She is famous for her extensive research on the growth mindset. Dweck's research conclusively demonstrates that individuals who believe their abilities and circumstances can be improved through dedicated effort and learning are vastly more likely to achieve success.
Right.
The text aggressively contrasts this growth mindset with the cultural environment many people are raised in today.
The author argues we're raising an entire generation in a culture that explicitly conditions them to externalize blame. If a child gets a bad grade, it is the teacher's fault. If a young adult can't find a good job, it's the boomer's fault for ruining the economy. If they are unhappy, it is capitalism's fault.
The text posits that if you are raised in an environment that constantly reinforces the idea that your failures are the result of systemic oppression or external actors, you are systematically being robbed of your belief in your own agency.
You are being meticulously built into a professional victim.
Exactly. The author argues this is not just a bad habit, it is a psychological prison that ensures you will remain poor. Because why would you ever exert the immense effort required to build wealth if you genuinely believe this system will just steal it from you anyway?
And to break people out of this prison, the author does this brilliant, almost subversive reinterpretation of a psychological concept we hear constantly in mainstream culture. The text takes aim at Brené Brown's incredibly famous TED Talk, The Power of Vulnerability. Now, let me play the skeptic again here.
Go for it.
Usually when modern culture talks about vulnerability, it means opening up emotionally, crying, sharing your trauma, and essentially embracing fragility as a strength.
Right.
How on earth does a book dedicated to rugged masculine self-reliance incorporate the concept of vulnerability?
Well, the author argues that modern society has completely misinterpreted and hijacked Brown's original work.
Okay.
The text asserts that true vulnerability is not about wallowing in weakness or using your trauma as a shield to excuse your failures. According to the book, true vulnerability is the most terrifying thing a man can do.
Which is?
Taking absolute, uncompromising responsibility for every single aspect of his life.
So it's looking in the mirror and saying, I am broke, I am out of shape, my relationships are failing, and it is 100% my fault.
Exactly. The text argues that it takes profound vulnerability to drop the excuses, to stop blaming the economy or your ex-wife, to look at your own glaring flaws, own your story, and take brutal ownership of what you need to fix.
That is a tough pill to swallow for a lot of guys.
It is. But to prove that this radical shift in mindset actually yields real-world economic results, the text provides several compelling case studies of people breaking the cycle of dependency.
The first one he details is the story of a small town in Texas that had been struggling with deep generational poverty for decades.
Right.
The standard government interventions hadn't worked. Then a local church stepped in. But they didn't just hand out food or pay people's electric bills.
Right. The text notes that the church recognized that pure charity often enables the very dependency it seeks to alleviate. Instead, they initiated a strict mentorship program focused entirely on personal accountability and skill building. They taught the men in the community to stop waiting for government grants, to stop blaming external factors, and to take immediate, tangible ownership of their lives and households.
And what were the results?
The text reports that within just a few years of implementing this mindset shift, the poverty rate in that specific town dropped by 20%.
20%. Just from a shift in mindset.
The author uses this to prove that the solution wasn't an infusion of capital. It was a shift in spiritual and psychological posture.
The book also details a movement among a group of locals in Detroit. These were men living in areas that had been economically devastated by the collapse of the auto industry and subsequent reliance on state welfare.
Right.
Instead of continuing to wait for the city government to revitalize their neighborhoods, they pooled whatever meager resources they had, they shared their trade skills, and began building their own small businesses. Landscaping, repair shops, local commerce. They actively chose the difficult path of local independence over the easy path of state reliance.
But perhaps the most illustrative anecdote in this section of the text is the story of a man named John.
This one stuck with me.
The author details that John was a chronic beggar who'd spent years living on the streets, surviving entirely on the charity and handouts of others.
Right.
He was the very definition of dependent. But the text describes a moment where a psychological switch flipped within him. He experienced a profound disgust with his own victimhood.
The book says he literally decided he was done being a victim. He actively started refusing handouts. He got the lowest level entry job he could find, worked relentlessly, saved every penny. And within a single calendar year, he had secured his own apartment and completely transformed his trajectory.
It's an incredible turnaround.
The author uses John's story to deliver a hard truth. Charity can keep you alive, but absolutely nothing replaces the transformative power of a man deciding to take absolute, uncompromising responsibility for himself.
Which serves as the perfect logical bridge to Chapter 9, where the text outlines its ultimate solution.
The core of the book.
Exactly. If the core problem is a systemic lack of agency and a culturally enforced mindset of dependency, the solution, according to the author, is the unapologetic embrace of true, integrated masculinity.
And the text aggressively pushes back against the pervasive modern academic and media narrative of toxic masculinity.
Very aggressive.
The author actually references a very well-known documentary called The Mask You Live In, which is frequently shown in schools to discuss how boys are socialized. But he interprets the premise entirely differently than the mainstream consensus.
Right.
Break down how the text views the struggles of modern young men.
The documentary and the mainstream narrative often argue that traditional masculine ideals, stoicism, competitiveness, aggression, are inherently toxic and damage young boys. The author completely rejects this premise. He agrees with the observation that young boys are deeply suffering in modern society. But he argues the cause is the exact opposite of what the mainstream claims.
Okay.
The text asserts that boys are suffering because they are constantly bombarded by societal pressures, telling them that their natural, biological, masculine instincts to compete, conquer, and protect are inherently evil.
Wow.
The author argues that masculinity is not the disease plaguing society. It is the cure that society has outlawed.
To define what he means by the cure, the author introduces a framework he calls the integrated masculinity model.
Right.
The text asks the reader to visualize a Venn diagram consisting of 3 overlapping circles. The first circle is strength. And the book is clear that this isn't just about deadlifting heavy weights, though physical capability is deemed important. It encompasses mental fortitude, emotional resilience, and the sheer grit required to withstand immense pressure without collapsing.
The second circle in the diagram is empathy. And as you noted earlier, empathy might seem like an unexpected inclusion in a book fiercely dedicated to reclaiming rugged masculinity.
It does seem counterintuitive at first.
However, the text argues that empathy is absolutely crucial. A man must be able to connect deeply, foster teamwork, and truly understand the emotional and physical needs of the family and the community he is tasked with protecting.
And the third circle is responsibility. This is the mechanism of taking ownership.
Right.
The text is very clear on why all 3 must be present simultaneously. The author explains that strength without empathy is simply tyranny, dominance, and bullying. Empathy without strength is mere fragility and weakness. You can understand someone's pain, but you are powerless to protect them from it.
Exactly.
And responsibility without strength simply leads to being crushed by the burden and burning out. True, integrated masculinity, according to the text, is the precise intersection of all 3 traits.
When a man successfully embodies that integrated model, the text states he becomes what is termed a masculine anchor.
A masculine anchor, I like that.
He becomes an immovable object of stability that grounds his family amidst chaos. And the author argues that this does not just benefit the individual household, it creates a tangible ripple effect throughout the broader community.
Right.
To prove that this model has real-world statistical impact, the text shares several highly engaging anecdotes of masculine leadership transforming environments.
The first story the book highlights is about a man named James in Birmingham. James observed that the young men in his specific neighborhood lacked any positive outlets, had no male role models, and were rapidly drifting into antisocial behavior and petty crime. Now, the modern instinct would be to petition the city council for a grant, form a committee, and wait for the state to solve the problem. James didn't do that.
No, he acted as a masculine anchor. The text details how James took the initiative to start a local football league himself.
He just built it.
He didn't just teach them how to play a sport. He used the structure of the game to instill discipline, the value of teamwork, respect for authority, and the consequences of their actions.
And the data backs up the result.
It does. The author provides the resulting data. Within a single year of James running this league, antisocial behavior incidents in that specific neighborhood dropped by 20%.
The book then moves to the story of John in Manchester. John's background was much darker. He was a former gang leader who had spent significant time incarcerated in the prison system.
Right.
But upon his release, he underwent a massive personal transformation, aligning perfectly with the author's concept of taking absolute responsibility. John decided he needed to mentor the at-risk youth who were following in his exact destructive footsteps.
John utilizes inherent masculine traits, his strength, his understanding of the streets, and his newly found responsibility to start a local boxing club. The text emphasizes that he didn't just lecture these kids about staying out of trouble, which rarely works. He provided a physical outlet.
Right.
He taught them how to channel their natural biological aggression into a highly disciplined sport. He taught them emotional control under physical duress. He taught them how to be men.
And what was the impact on the community?
The result of John's localized masculine leadership was a staggering 30% reduction in local crime rates in the immediate vicinity of the boxing club.
And the author pairs these specific anecdotes with broad, undeniable statistical data to validate the premise.
Yes.
The text notes that sociological data consistently shows that communities with active, present male role models experience a 25% lower youth delinquency rate.
That's significant.
Furthermore, the book cites statistics demonstrating that boys who are paired with active male mentors are 60% less likely to drop out of high school. 60%.
The data the author presents absolutely validates the core thesis. The ripple effect of strong masculine leadership is the most effective poverty reduction program in existence.
This comprehensive analysis naturally raises the most important question for you, the listener.
Which is?
How do you actually apply these massive macro, historical, and psychological ideas to the micro reality of your daily life?
Right. How do you execute on this?
In the final sections of the text, the author outlines a practical foundation of action. He introduces the concept of initiating a resilience chain reaction.
Break that concept down. What does a resilience chain reaction look like in practice?
The text defines it as the understanding that your personal choices do not happen in a vacuum. When you make the grueling, difficult choice to endure hardship, to reject victimhood, and to grow stronger despite the obstacles, the men around you, your sons, your brothers, your friends, witness that resilience. Your refusal to break gives them the silent permission and inspiration to endure their own struggles.
It's contagious. Exactly. The author also advocates for joining or starting what he calls a heroic imagination project.
Which sounds like something out of a comic book, but the text grounds it in very practical psychology.
It does.
The book describes it as actively training your mind to view your daily struggles, your financial hardships, or your career setbacks, not as evidence of your victimization, but as the necessary training ground for your own heroism. It is a cognitive reframing technique.
Crucially, the author advises men to reject the chaotic, ever-changing morals of modern society and instead embrace foundational, traditional philosophies that have structured successful civilizations for millennia. Specifically, the text points to Stoicism.
Let's define Stoicism in the context of this book, because it's become a bit of an internet buzzword. The author isn't talking about just suppressing your emotions and never smiling.
No. The text utilizes the classical definition of Stoicism as a pragmatic operational strategy. It is the rigorous practice of ruthlessly dividing the world into two categories: things you can control and things you cannot. The author argues that a man must focus 100% of his energy, anxiety, and effort entirely on what he can control: his work ethic, his physical fitness, his reactions, his family structure. He must simultaneously discard all anxiety and complaining about what he cannot control: macroeconomic trends, the opinions of the media, or the policies in the federal government.
The book also highlights a philosophy that might surprise some readers: Confucianism.
Right.
The text notes that the intense focus on rigid family values, profound respect for elders and hierarchy, and the unwavering sense of duty to one's community found in Confucianism is exactly the philosophical engine that drove the massive, historically unprecedented economic miracles of nations like China, Singapore, and South Korea.
It's a proven societal operating system.
The author argues that adopting these highly structured, duty-bound philosophies is the antidote to the chaotic, hyper-individualistic modern culture.
And it is very important to note here, as we approach the end of the text, that the author is not an anarchist. He does not state that all forms of government are inherently evil or unnecessary. The book argues that government does have a valid role, but it must be strictly structured, severely limited in its scope, and absolutely ruthless in its eradication of corruption.
The text uses Singapore in the 1960s under the leadership of Lee Kuan Yew as the ultimate case study for proper governance.
A fascinating example.
Singapore transitioned from a struggling, deeply impoverished, resource-poor city-state into one of the wealthiest, most advanced global economic powerhouses on the planet in a single generation. How did they achieve that?
According to the text, it wasn't through massive welfare programs or state-sponsored dependency.
No.
It was achieved through intense institutional transparency, the strictest anti-corruption measures in the world, and the creation of an environment that heavily, almost exclusively, rewarded absolute merit and relentless hard work.
Yeah.
The author's conclusion on the state is that a proper government's only role is to ensure a fair, uncorrupted playing field and to enforce the law, not to step onto the fields and play the game for you, or to rig the score to ensure equal outcomes.
So, synthesizing everything we have unpacked today, what does this all mean?
It's a lot to process.
It is. The overarching message of Conrad Reicher's Poverty and the Path to Power is an uncompromising call to radical self-ownership. It requires you to actively and consciously reject the modern societal myths that romanticize victimhood and weakness. It requires you to clearly understand how our historical institutions were systematically captured by Marxist and radical feminist ideologies that ultimately seek to make you dependent, compliant, and docile.
Right.
And most importantly, the text demands that you reclaim your personal responsibility and step fully into integrated, unashamed masculine leadership.
It is a demanding text, and before we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought that is not explicitly written in the book, but builds directly upon the foundation of its premise.
Okay, let's hear it.
In a hyper-connected, politically charged world, where every single institution, every social media algorithm, and every media outlet seems perfectly designed to tell you exactly how to think, how to feel, and exactly who you should blame for your life's problems. What if the ultimate, most dangerous act of rebellion is simply closing your front door, taking absolute, uncompromising responsibility for the lives inside your own home, and silently building your own empire from the ground up?
That is a phenomenal thought to end on. Close the door and build the empire. Listen to me. If you extracted value from the intense breakdowns in this deep dive today, you need to hit that like button and subscribe to the podcast right now.
Do it right now.
We are bringing you these comprehensive analyses every single week. More urgently, if the concepts we discussed today resonated with you, you need to go to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books right this second and buy Poverty and the Path to Power by Conrad Reicher.
It's a must-read.
If you genuinely want to understand the history of our institutions before they were captured, and if you want the actual unvarnished blueprint for taking your life back, this book is your red pill. Go buy it.
Highly recommend.
And do not forget to keep up with the author's ongoing work by following him at Conrad Reicher on Substack. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today, for keeping an open, critical mind, and for doing the hard work. We will see you on the next deep dive.